There's been a massive international effort to water down the peace plan Donald Trump presented to Ukraine last week, which would have forced them to hand over loads of territory to Russia. What on earth has gone on and what could happen next? We will try and work it out on this latest episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio in Salford, and the first half of this episode of Newscast is going to be about the immense amount of diplomatic activity around Ukraine and Russia over the last few days. At the end of last week, we saw the emergence of this US 28-point peace plan to end the war between Russia and Ukraine, which many people say bore all the fingerprints of Russia. Then we saw a very dramatic address to the Ukrainian people by Volodymyr Zelensky at the end of last week. Then there was a whole load of European leaders meeting on the fringes of the G20 summit in South Africa, working out how to respond. Then over the weekend, there were meetings between the US and Ukraine in Geneva in Switzerland. And all throughout this process, we saw what appeared to be, or hints of, or briefings that there had been a watering down of this plan, which had been so initially unwelcome for the Ukrainians. So where have we got to and what can we work out about what might be happening next? Two people who can help us brainstorm that are with us now. James Landale is the BBC's diplomatic correspondent, and he's back from Kyiv to sit in the Newscast studio in London. Hi, James.
Hello, Adam.
And BBC chief presenter in Washington, D.C., Caitriona Perry, is in Washington, D.C. Hello, Caitriona.
Hello, Adam. Hi, James.
Hey.
Right. I'm tempted to sort of just dive straight into what's going on right now in terms of the US, Ukraine and Russia. But I wonder if maybe we should rewind a little bit to the ancient history of about 4 days ago. And Caitriona, what's your understanding of where this 28-point so-called peace plan actually came from? How did it emerge out into the world?
Well, there are many versions of that, and it's approaching Thanksgiving here, so there is a lot of socializing going on in Washington, D.C., and pretty much from Thursday night onwards, it has been the talk of the town. Who owned this plan? Where did it come from? Many people being told that it came straight from Moscow. A lot of very senior people, that's what they've been told by the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio himself, who has later gone on to deny that. But we've heard from US senators on the record that he has told them that this was a plan hatched between the US envoy to Ukraine, Russia, Middle East and everywhere, really, Steve Witkoff, with Moscow. And then that was kind of brought back and a version of it given to the Ukrainians. So that's where we're at. I mean, definitely when you read it, it reads like a wish list from Moscow, doesn't it? I mean, there's no way there are Ukrainian handprints on that anywhere, and we've spoken on our programs here to many Ukrainian MPs who said they knew nothing about it until this plan arrived from the Secretary of the Army, Dan Driscoll, last week. He was in Kyiv and gave it to Zelensky in their meeting. So the Ukrainians are very annoyed about it. The Europeans are very annoyed about it, because also in the plan are things that the EU is supposed to do, which they were not consulted about either. So a bit of a hot mess at this point, although a deadline on that hot mess, because President Trump has put a deadline of Thanksgiving, which is Thursday, to do a deal, although Marco Rubio has watered that down and rode that back a bit.
Right. We'll dig into the details of some of the 28 points in a second. But James, just in terms of the rollout of this and how it gathered momentum and became taken increasingly seriously, Volodymyr Zelensky did that address to the nation outside his office at the end of last week. And that sort of made this feel like a very, very serious moment rather than some sort of blue sky, pie in the sky thinking.
Yes, it did. Not just because Mr. Zelensky's tone, because sometimes, he can do those sort of his nightly addresses or things. And sometimes it's just him and a camera phone and he just finds another place in the presidential palace to do it. This was filmed. It was somber. It was meant to be a moment. And I think what was really significant was when he said, look, the Ukraine now faces a choice between its freedom and dignity and potentially losing a partner, namely the United States. Such was the Ukrainian concern about this initial 28-point document. And I think that that message from Zelensky, I think, sort of sobered a few minds up across the world, because I think suddenly, crikey, are we really at that place already where the Ukrainians are thinking they're going to have to make that choice? Because, if ever that choice were to be made, the consequences would be profound. And so I think that sort of steadied the ship slightly, because initially it became a sort of almost. Caitriona will know more about this, but almost a sort of a narrative about internal Washington politics and who's got some power within the White House and where this came from and who's denying which bit of it and all the rest of it. I think what's happened now is people have realised that, regardless of the genesis of that document, there is now a substantive discussion to be had, and that's been taken forward. It wouldn't surprise me if that original 28-point document, which some people have sort of assessed as being reading as if it has been translated literally from the Russian, because of the if you're a Russian speaker, people say that you can tell from the way that's been translated into the English that perhaps it originally came from the Russian. Regardless of all of that, there are now substantive issues on the table that are being discussed.
Well, yeah, James, it's interesting. Two things there. One, you've explained very clearly why it went from on sort of Thursday night, Friday morning, feeling like it was a document handed over to the Ukrainians and sign here or else, to actually now much more of a discussion. And second of all, yeah, it's got 28 points. I mean, it's hard to keep a list of 28 things in your head in one go, although you probably can. But actually, it's clarified a lot of the issues. And that does give you a basis for some discussions, even if the discussions aren't actually Ukraine and Russia around a table solving this.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that what's happening now is that I think serious discussions have been had by the Europeans and by the Ukrainians and the Americans, on some of the issues that could be tied up. A lot of that original document, when I read it, I've read a lot of these kind of documents over the years, and it just read a little bit strange.
Oh, it's so weird. And I'm not an expert like you are, but I just think back to my time in Brussels looking at papers and non-papers and things being searched. It was very weird.
Yeah, there were oddities, there were sort of ambiguities, slightly random sentences. So some analysts just said this doesn't actually read like a serious sort of document. I think what's they're doing now is they're going through all of that and tidying it up. So there's been a very interesting interview by Sergei Kyslytsya, who is the deputy foreign minister. Kyslytsya, who was actually in the room for these talks, and he's given an interview to the FT in which he says the 28 points have now been boiled down to 19 points, and what they're doing is that they're discussing and making progress on the areas where they know they've got common ground. This is the Americans and the Ukrainians, and then they're basically leaving the difficult stuff to be discussed by, at presidential level. So, we're talking, that's the sort of thing which is, territorial issues, issues of, future relationship between the US and NATO and Ukraine and Russia and things like that. That is being left for another day. But what they are doing is paring it down and looking at stuff where they can reach agreement. So that could be on, financing, reconstruction plans, all of those kind of things, which are still included in this document, but are less contentious.
And Caitriona, as usual, it's quite hard to judge where Donald Trump is on Ukraine at the moment, because 1 minute he's sounding very, very harsh and he's firing off messages on Truth Social saying things like Zelensky has shown zero gratitude to the US, kind of reminiscent of that terrible meeting they had in the Oval Office. But then at other points, yeah, he's like taking his foot off the gas on the deadline.
Yeah, it's really curious. And we gave up a long time ago trying to second guess how President Trump approaches these things and what is his sort of strategy there. But regardless, Marco Rubio has been trying to do a massive cleanup operation over the weekend. The couple of press conferences he did, he said, maybe 24 times, oh, the negotiations are going brilliant. This is great. There's no animosity, which what you were just discussing there gave nothing but a tone of animosity with that threat from President Trump earlier. We have a post from him just in the last half an hour or so saying, is it really possible that big progress is being made in peace talks between Russia and Ukraine? Question mark, question mark, question mark. Don't believe it until you see it, but something good just may be happening. God bless America. So who knows, more cryptic words there from the president to try and decipher. But, you know, as you guys were just saying, we do know that talks are happening, negotiations are happening on something. And that is the positive point that people are trying to pull from this, because there really was a sense of panic a couple of days ago about the direction that this might be going in.
Yeah, I'm kind of conflicted about how deeply we should dig into the 28 points now, because I'm not sure how real they are or whether it's a valuable use of our time, because some of them seem quite outlandish. But I suppose we may as well, 'cause it's an interesting exercise. James, in terms of territory, what does this document suggest?
Well, it's slightly confused. So first of all, it says that all the existing territory that Russia holds in eastern Ukraine would be de facto Russian, but not de jure. In other words, the world would just sort of accept that Russia happens to physically control that because it's taken that territory by military means, but it doesn't actually formally own it legally, i.e. de jure. So that's relatively straightforward. But then it says the rest of the Donbass region, i.e. the area that forms Luhansk and Donetsk together, the original document says, well, Ukraine should just give that bit up. The bit that, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian servicemen and women have died and been injured to defend, they should just give that up. But then Russia should, and this is where the document's really odd, says actually, yeah, that should be considered formal Russian territory. In other words, de jure, they actually formally own that. But we should then treat that as demilitarized, and Russia should not put any forces there. So in other words, we got an illustration there of the contradiction within the document.
So some bits of the Donbass would be occupied by Russian soldiers, but not really Russian. And then other areas of the Donbass which are not occupied by Russian soldiers would be Russian.
Correct. Look, the fundamental point actually for this is, in terms of the dispute between both sides, is do you start with a ceasefire and just accept that begins from where the line of contact is now? In other words, just accept, look, that's where the war is, that's where the line is, and we just have to accept that as a sort of, not accepting any kind of legal, jurisdiction of either side, but just saying, look, that is where it is, and then let's have a ceasefire, and which is sort of more where you'd expect the Ukrainians to be relatively sanguine with that. I think for the Ukrainians, the idea of actually giving up territory they currently hold is a very, very, very red line indeed. Not least because of the principle it concedes, but also in terms of the geographic highland that it gives Russia, the power, these fortress towns of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk and others, that it means that if Russia were minded to re-invade Ukraine in a future time, it would be in a much stronger military position to do so.
And then there is an offer of security guarantees for Ukraine from, well, somebody. But James, that's just it. That just says there'll be some security guarantees. No details of what that would look, who would be providing them, what the terms and conditions would be.
Yeah, there's been a lot of speculation about this. Various versions, sort of lightweight versions of the NATO Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all versions of this. I thought it was really interesting listening to the former head of British intelligence was on the Radio 4 this morning, and he said, look, whatever security guarantees are offered by the United States in the future, ultimately, what matters is whether or not Ukraine can defend itself, because no country can ultimately rely on another country for its security, as we have learnt in recent days. In other words, what Ukraine needs is a strong, big army that can basically, it's what he called the porcupine principle. In other words, it just makes Ukraine too prickly to reinvade. And that ultimately would be the ultimate security guarantee, regardless of any kind of oral or verbal textual commitment made by the United States and NATO or any other country.
And Caitriona, there's lots of kind of metaphorical dollar signs threaded throughout this document for the US, isn't there? There's a big economic element and a big kind of payday for the Trump administration, in theory.
Yeah, and this has a lot of people scratching heads over there. I mean, we've talked a lot about Russia's frozen assets as a result of various sanctions, be they from the US or the EU. This document proposed that $100 billion of frozen Russian assets should be invested in what are called US-led efforts to rebuild and invest in Ukraine, and the US would receive 50% of the profits for that, whereas the Europeans would have to add in another $100 billion to that. Those figures, of course, not coming close to the estimation of what it would take to actually rebuild Ukraine. That's more pitched over $500 million or so. There also would be a remainder of some frozen assets that would go into what's called a US-Russian investment vehicle. So Russia would see some of its money come back, and again, a financial benefit there for the US. So, no real detail. I mean, we don't have really detail on anything, do we? But definitely a payday at some point for the Americans, a price on whatever they would put in here. And, that's where you do see a little bit of the American fingerprints on this document, because President Trump has said so many times that he's not doing anything, kind of for the rest of the world for free anymore, that's not America first foreign policy, and he doesn't want to be involved in that sort of thing.
And James, just in terms of the processology now, so we've had meetings between Russia and the US, which is what generated this 28-point plan. We then had meetings with people like Keir Starmer and the German Chancellor in the G20 summit in South Africa. So the Europeans had a meeting there. Then we had these discussions between the Ukrainians and the US in Switzerland over the weekend, and people like Jonathan Powell, the British National Security Advisor, were involved in them. Has that all stopped now? And then we're just waiting to see who else meets who, where, about what?
Yeah, I mean, there were further European discussions today in Angola at an EU-Africa summit. So there have been more discussions there with some heads of government on the EU front. We think the negotiations in Geneva have wound up for the moment. So the big question now is what's in that text, what as it currently stands, and how is that then communicated to the Russians, and in what format do the Americans and the Russians now have some kind of communication? So that's the next move, I think, in the game.
And it sounds like that deadline of Thursday for Thanksgiving has slipped a bit. James, I know you've got to go, but just before you do, you're in Kyiv for a couple of weeks. How does it feel being there at the moment and linking up what's actually happening there with all this stuff that's happening in the diplomatic ether?
Two things, really. One is whenever I go to Ukraine, I'm constantly reminded afresh of the resilience of the country and its people and its willingness to carry on. I do not get any sense yet of a wish to end its defence. Yes, people are tired. Yes, people are frustrated. Yes, there's a little bit more politics in the air in Kiev, and the army is struggling to get the numbers. The numbers of desertions are ticking up, and do you know what I mean? That there are things that are looking, a few warning signs. But ultimately, if you talk to people, they say, "Look, we've just got to carry on. We have no choice." The one thing I would also mention, though, is that the allegations of corruption that are gripping the government in Kiev at the moment, this idea of $100 million of government cash being creamed off in kickbacks by, allegedly some ministers and officials at the heart of the government, some of whom have denied the allegations, is the hot topic. And it is the question around that is what are the political consequences for Zelensky? Does it make his government more fragile, more brittle, and how does it impact any kind of negotiations long term? The idea that suddenly a Russian-generated discussion about some new peace plan emerges just at this moment when the corruption scandal has come to the fore, I think that conjunction of events did not surprise me at all.
James, thank you very much, and good to have you back.
Thanks so much.
And Caitriona, just before you go, I think it's a bit cheesy when people talk about bromances in politics. It's a bit kind of like 2016. But seeing Zoran Mamdani, the new mayor of New York, in the Oval Office with Donald Trump, two sworn enemies who are opposite ends of the political spectrum, they loved each other. They had a great time.
Oh my gosh, it was extraordinary to watch, especially, you know, when you think of some of the comments that each has said about the other over the last few weeks and months, really. I mean, they were sworn enemies, and Mamdani, even in his acceptance speech just a couple of weeks ago in New York, you know, saying, Donald Trump, are you listening? Turn up the volume. I'm coming for you. And if you want to do anything, you're going to have to come through all the immigrants in New York, this kind of thing. And suddenly he's standing there beside the president who's seated at his desk, and it's all laughing and kind of Donald Trump fist bumping him and touching him on the arm, and, you know, very, very jolly, and we can work together and all of this kind of thing was really interesting.
And I want to clarify your answer to Stephen Nelson. He asked about your comment calling the president a fascist, and your answer was, both President Trump and I have been clear about our positions and our views. Are you affirming that you think President Trump is a fascist?
I've spoken about...
That's okay, you can just say yes.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's easier. It's
Yes.
easier than explaining it. I don't mind.
But, you know, I suppose at the heart of it, you have two politicians who are kind of populist in their views in a way. So some of their policies would kind of be aligned, and particularly President Trump knows that he's in trouble on this point of affordability and cost of living here in this country. It's still really, really expensive for groceries and so on. And Mamdani was able to run so successfully on that perhaps President Trump is thinking of taking a page or two out of his playbook. So we'll see what happens. I mean, that was then. There's a long road ahead.
Yes. I also now just worry that every world leader will have watched that meeting and gone and taken the lesson. Right, I need to really, really just convey to Donald Trump how much of a winner I am, because it's true that he responds really well to people who've won things. And we will now see every leader trying to find the tiniest bit of data from their most recent elections that shows what a winner they are.
Mamdani, you know, Donald Trump said at one point, he even won some of my voters, I hear, I'm told. And Mamdani was like, yes, I did, 1 in 10 of them. It was quite funny little interactions. It was jokey, but at the same time, little spiky edge in there as well.
Well, Caitriona, good to catch up. I won't wish you happy Thanksgiving yet, because we'll probably be speaking before then, because it's only Monday and Thanksgiving is on Thursday.
It's a long way.
Time.
It's a long way till Thursday.
But take care and see you soon.
Long time in this town. All right, talk soon. Bye.
Now, friend of the podcast, Professor Jane Green, who's director of the Nuffield Politics Research Centre and also president of the British Polling Council, has done a bit of research into how voters are feeling about the economy, and specifically why the performance of the economy and how people are feeling about their own finances is driving Labour voters away from Labour. So we thought that would be an interesting backdrop for what is coming on Wednesday. And I'm pleased to say Professor Green joins us now again on Newscast. Hello.
Thank you, Adam. It's very nice to be here.
Well, good to have you. We'll talk about the research you've done in a second, but I just wanted to ask you a more kind of general question about public opinion and the budget. And I mean, everyone in Westminster is treating this budget as if it's a sort of make or break moment for the government. And politically, it might end up being. But in terms of how people perceive it, could it be?
There's one hesitation I have with this, Adam, which is that we keep on building up these moments, and then a week later there's a new moment, and then we've forgotten about the moment that's just gone past. So, you know, one can't say that this is going to be definitely the moment where Labour's polling is going to radically change or something like that. But I think more broadly, fundamentally, Labour has to do something. If it's not this week, they have to do it over the coming months, or ideally the sooner the better. And that is that we're in a very significant rut in terms of economic pessimism. And around a third, according to our research, of the population is feeling very worried about their finances. And that's a huge number. Now, is that going to change because of a budget? Not in a week, of course not. But is Rachel Reeves able to give greater confidence, to give a greater sense that things might start to get better for households? And if that were the case, then I think this could be seen as a turning point.
Hence why we now see every government minister saying one of the big chunks of this budget will be about helping with the cost of living.
And I think there are many people in the country that might be thinking, well, finally, you know, because clearly there are real political difficulties navigating a very fragmented confusing electoral landscape. And I think there have been lots of distractions in that process. So, lots of talk last week only by the government on immigration. And meanwhile, the cost of living is the thing that's preoccupying people. It's their daily worry. It's their daily sense of concern. And so recognizing that the cost of living is the preoccupation for so many people in this country and who are looking to the government for a sense of, understanding those problems, but also providing some solutions to them is absolutely critical. And I think, therefore, talking about the cost of living and giving people a sense of progress towards a bit of sense of optimism, confidence, and greater clarity is going to be really critical. And I think, that's talking about that priority is clearly in line with the priorities of the public.
Which brings us to this research you've done for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation group. And you're looking at why Labour have appeared to lose so much support from the people that voted for them at the general election in 2024.
Exactly.
And you found that basically there is one key driver, and we've just been talking about it.
Yeah, it's so critical. I mean, what we've discovered, we've surveyed people over a year's period, and we've gone and we've asked them questions, and we've gone back to the same people and asked more questions and gone back again. And so you can see that sense of what's changing for people and what is the effect of that change. So if people feel more economically insecure, they're more likely to have defected from the Labour Party. And that's 3 times more important than if they've hardened their attitudes on immigration. So that kind of 3 times figure is very, very important for Labour. And also, it's that sense of economic insecurity, those worries about finances. They're not just important because of the magnitude of how much damage that's doing to the Labour Party in terms of their support. And they have lost an unprecedentedly large amount of support in just a year. But it's also that support's going splintering in all directions. And so if you wanted to kind of, get back the people who are tempted to right-wing parties, say Reform UK, and you also wanted to offer something for those people who are tempted at parties on the left, such as the Greens or perhaps the Lib Dems, depending on where you put them in the ideological space, then those economic worries are the critical thing. So they really matter across the board. They matter in magnitude. And they're also having a number of indirect effects. So if you
just explain what you mean by an indirect effect.
Yeah, of course. So if you think about kind of something having a bang-on direct effect, I feel more worried about the economy and therefore I'm going to look for another political party. If you think about an indirect effect, it's kind of what that's doing to other things. So what we found in our research at Nuffield College is that if people feel that kind of sense of economic worry, that's also magnifying those losses on the issue of immigration. And it's also magnifying losses because people rate the Labour Party as less competent for managing the national economy as well. So if you feel, it makes loads of sense, right? If you feel more worried about your own personal finances, you also think Labour is managing the economy less well, and you're more likely to exit that Labour support because of the national economy, or like I say, even because you're going to then choose a party that's closest to you on the immigration issue. And so essentially that's why we kind of think about these economic worries as being so foundational for Labour's support, because they're having broad effects and all right across the ideological spectrum.
And in terms of economic insecurity, I mean, we can sort of have a feel for what that means, but did you boil that down into actual particular facets of people's lives that then gets bundled together in this category of economic insecurity?
Yeah, it's a great question, Adam. And so, like, if you think about what is economic insecurity, I mean, obviously it's a label, right? But it's really people's economic worries about their household and their family. It's that sense of anxiety, that sense of having to feel worried and concerned and stressed about something. So what's driving that? Well, it seems to be very highly correlated with things like savings, not having enough savings, not being able to, make a debt repayment if you had one, mortgage outgoings, and also that sense that you have greater outgoings, so people that have greater, more children, and also even a sense that you couldn't rely on the state, the welfare state, the benefit system if you needed it. And so there's a broad set of kind of economic factors that are making people feel more insecure. And we actually find also that people in their midlife really get a sense of these greater sense of stresses and worries about money and about finances, which makes a lot of sense when you think that the outgoings are so much greater in midlife, and also wider pressures on people, and obviously the affordability of housing being a key critical one there.
And that's so interesting because that's not just people on low incomes who
Right.
receive a lot of attention in the political debate,
Yeah.
or pensioners who receive a lot of attention in the political debate.
Yeah.
That's lots of other people, some of whom you might even think is doing fairly well, like fairly well off.
Yeah, and obviously, people on lower incomes who are genuinely in poverty are going to be feeling a very acute sense of these worries. But like you say, it's a broader set of people also who are feeling very concerned about their finances. And if you think, we've been obviously in a very prolonged period of negativity on the economy and austerity and so on, and a cost of living crisis. If you think people have eroded their savings, they're finding that it's not easy to make ends meet every month. Those people, so many people in work in that category, and so many people who you would have thought would have had enough and now no longer finding that they do. Whereas many pensioners could be on low incomes, but have large assets and savings to fall back on. And indeed, it's, just on average, not every pensioner clearly, but on average, it's the group who are retired who tend to feel the least worried on average about their finances. So income, it tells us part of the story, but not the whole story.
This is also adding a little bit more fuel to my theory that I was formulating this morning on 5 Live, which is that everyone's focusing on the budget in terms of how much tax is going to be raised and who's going to feel that the most. And actually, will there still be a knock-on effect from the fact that they were thinking about increasing income tax and all that stuff, all that politics we've been talking about for months. But then at the same time, Sky News was reporting this morning that the Office for Budget Responsibility is going to downgrade the growth forecasts for the rest of this Parliament. This is in addition to the downgrade we think is already coming for the productivity of the economy in the past and the future. And now all of this is making me think that actually the conversation after the budget might not be about tax rises or difficult choices ducked or whatever. It's going to be about the fact that this whole Parliament is going to feel really bad in all the things that you just said.
Yeah, and if living standards as projected are going to decline over this period of the Labour Party being in government before the next election, then that's very, very serious, of course, for any government seeking re-election. And of course, extremely serious for the people experiencing that decline. And I think, we've been in this kind of a weird period, haven't we, frankly, where there's been so much speculation over this budget. And the primary worry there is that the markets, don't react very well to uncertainty and to that ongoing speculation and just want certainty. And I think, the broader sense that we're finding in our surveys is that broader sense of economic worry is, that matters to people too. So if all you're hearing for week after week after week is the government's not quite sure about what it's doing and is going to maybe do this, maybe doing that, that's not going to give people confidence either. And it's that broader sense of economic worry that's then driving, okay, well, now I don't trust Labour on the economy, and now I'm going to look to other parties. And, it really, I can't express just kind of strongly enough how big the losses that Labour has experienced are, and how profoundly important those are for our changing electoral landscape. And, clearly Labour has to do something to turn around its electoral fortunes. And what our research shows is that if people feel more confident in their household finances, less sense of this concern, then that's going to have multiple benefits for the Labour Party. And of course, it's relevant for the other political parties as well.
I do just thinking back to that last episode of Newscast we did about a month ago, where you said, and I actually went into Downing Street and presented some of this to people in Downing Street as a completely non-partisan but just interesting person. And I think that is probably when ministers started talking about the cost of living again, because they hadn't talked about it as a political issue in quite such explicit terms. And then it's almost like a switch was flicked in Downing Street and everyone started talking about the cost of living. And then, hey presto, you get the pre-budget announcement of freezing rail fares in England next year and not going up by inflation, and that being billed as a big cost of living measure, which helps with economic insecurity.
I think you might also be giving me a little bit too much credit for going into Downing Street and changing the direction of the government. But in all seriousness,
she changed history.
what we're trying to do is do research that's in the public benefit, right? And obviously the Joseph Rowntree Foundation also wants to do this, and then they're not directing the findings of our research. They're saying, let's go and understand how this is happening, and what we're doing totally independently and objectively. is identifying things that we're very, very, very keen to share with all interested parties, and that we hope informs the debate and really sheds light on people's concerns, because ultimately that's better political representation for those people who are sitting at home feeling stressed about finances.
Well, yeah, and of course the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, they've got a goal, and that is addressing poverty and economic insecurity. As a pollster, if you'd come up with results that sort of didn't help them, what would have happened to that data?
Oh, well, we would have put it out, and we would have said these are the facts, and this is they care about accuracy and about truthfulness and rigor as anybody else. But we are at the moment in a period of time where cost of living is a preeminent concern for people. There's been an accumulation of people's worries and problems on the economy. And, we're in a political, and I think because we as political scientists, we've taken a broad view with this research. We've compared feelings of economic insecurity with concerns around immigration, because it would be too easy to say, well, let's focus on the economy and show what people care about. But no, we're really clearly assessing the relative problems and dilemmas that the Labour Party has in addressing these two sets of very important concerns to people. And it's only by doing that you can kind of give a balanced assessment.
And we haven't really talked about the second one yet, which is concerns about immigration, which a lot of people have. But what's a way of thinking about that keeps it in proportion to actually how the public is thinking about this issue based on the research you've done?
Yeah, clearly immigration is a different type of concern, isn't it? So if you think, what matters to people on a daily basis is those kind of economic worries. Immigration is clearly important to many people in the country, but it might not have that kind of day-to-day resonance. Now, in our research, what we were able to do is say, okay, let's take these two really big issues that people care about. They're the two most important issues in polling, and let's just see what the relative impacts are. So let's look at a change in this and a change in that, and what does that do? So these are statistical kind of analyses and models. But just to simplify it, immigration is essentially a trade-off for Labour, and it's in the kind of segment of issues where it's important to people who might be switching to reform. That's only about 10% of Labour's losses. It's also important for people that might switch to the Lib Dems. But we're seeing it also as something that, in a sense, comes in a sequence after those economic worries. So if you're, somebody on the left or the right, you're worried about your finances, okay, that's the thing that pushes you away from Labour. But then you're going to a political party that's closer to your views on immigration. You're also going to a party that you think might handle the national economy better. But it's a real trade-off for Labour. They're going to experience, losses and gains depending on what kind of approach they take on immigration. Whereas those kind of the sort of precipitating factor, those worries about the economy, would indeed kind of essentially neutralise some of those losses for them. Whereas, so if you think about kind of the balance of things, that economic story is much broader, and it's just a win for Labour if they can help it make people feel economically secure. Now, actually, where we really see lots of losses on the immigration issue is kind of an untouched topic, Adam. I mean, hardly anyone's talking about this, and yet it's really fascinating and it's really unprecedented. And that is the Conservatives are still losing support. Now, they lost a lot of support in government, but it's almost unheard of for a party, the main party in opposition, to continue to lose support. And most of Reform's gains are from Conservative voters, either last time or the time before. And it's really the immigration issue that's still driving a lot of those losses, which, of course, in a highly fragmented context, the viability of the Conservative Party matters just as much as the viability of the Labour Party.
But does that mean, when we talk about people going to reform, though, does that mean they're actually going to reform because of how they feel Nigel Farage and his colleagues might manage the economy? Or is it just because reform just seemed like the best alternative once you've lost faith with Labour on the economy? You're not proactively going to reform because of the economy. You're leaving Labour because of the economy.
Exactly. I think you've expressed that. Thank you very much, Adam. You've expressed that very well. It's exactly the latter. So, you're leaving Labour because of the economy, because of, your own worries. And then, if you're more broadly on the left on the immigration issue, you'll look for a party that's closer to you on that issue. And if you're more on the right, you'll look to a party that's closer to you on that issue. And so, it really is there's a leaving story, and then there's okay, which party's closer to me? But we don't see that if you feel more economically insecure, you think Labour's handled the immigration issue more poorly, or that you yourself get harder attitudes towards immigration or change your attitudes towards immigration. But rather you're kind of just picking the party that's closest to you once you've decided I just can't vote for this government anymore because of the economy. But on the right of politics, like I say, if you have a stronger view, a more anti-immigration position, and you voted Conservative, then you're going to Reform because you see that party is closer to your position on that issue. So there's lots of complexity in British politics at the moment. And I think there's a real risk that people look at it and think, oh my gosh, it's too complicated. It's almost paralyzing, I think, sometimes. It looks like sometimes... I don't know if I'm right or wrong in saying this, but, you almost get the sense there's a little bit rabbit in the headlights, that what do we do? We've got these losses on this side and we've got voters we're losing on this side, and maybe they'll back us come what may, and maybe they won't, and maybe they matter more. It's very complex. Yeah, but ultimately, is the economy stupid? And that's very simple. Were you just going to say that? I wondered
which one of us was going to say that first, because I was going to say this research is so interesting, and this has been a great conversation, and the only fly in the ointment is it proves yet again that terrible cliche, which was James Carville, Bill Clinton's advisor in 1992, who in a famous documentary about that election campaign is in a meeting with a load of whiteboards and a load of wonks, and he says, "It's the economy, stupid," because he's got quite a distinctive voice, and people have quoted it endlessly ever since. And it's true, obviously, and you've just proven that it's true. I just don't like the fact that it's such a cliche. It's like a human gif. It's like a human meme.
I am so sorry for being such a cliche, but it's
we made it quite a long way through the conversation.
It's not, but I think when they talked about that as saying the party that's trusted on the economy is going to win the election, right? Now, what we're saying is, it's actually much more personal than that. It's much more about people's worries day to day. And that's the context we're in. We are in a unique context. It's not like, oh, you're trusted on the economy, you're going to win the election, you don't need to know anything else. Actually, those worries are very, very personal to people. And it's those experiences and feelings of worry that are driving so many of these different political decisions and evaluations. So I can at least put a little bit of a updated personal twist on that.
Some originality on that cliche. Jane, thank you so much, and thanks for all that hard work. And it's an interesting way of looking at the data, which actually, looking at the big classic opinion polls, actually doesn't actually necessarily tell you. You have to dig into it in the way that you've done it to see how individuals actually behave.
Thanks, Adam.
So thank you.
Thanks so much.
A very interesting conversation with Professor Jane Green. Now, having just checked, I think James Carville didn't say it's the economy, stupid, in the documentary about Bill Clinton's election campaign. It was on the wall in their campaign HQ, but then he started saying it in the years afterwards because it was attributed to him. And that is all for this episode of Newscast. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll be back with another one very soon. Bye-bye.